He thought it was just another routine stop, another face that didn't belong. But he had no idea the moment he snapped those cuffs would change everything. The late afternoon sun hung low over a quiet suburban street just outside Dallas, casting long golden shadows across cracked pavement and rows of parked cars, the air thick with the scent of warm asphalt and motor oil. And there, bent over the open hood of a dark blue sedan, stood Marcus Reed, sleeves rolled up, hands stained with grease. Focused on the stubborn engine that refused to turn over, his movements calm, precise, almost practiced like a man who had done this 100 times before. The faint hum of passing traffic blending into the background until it was suddenly interrupted by the sharp crunch of tires pulling up too fast, too close. And in an instant the atmosphere shifted, the kind of shift you could feel before you even understood it, like the air tightening around your chest. Officer Ryan Cole stepped out of his patrol car with a rigid posture and narrowed eyes, his badge catching the sunlight just enough to draw attention, his presence immediate, commanding, and without hesitation he called out, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade, demanding to know what Marcus was doing, the tone already loaded with suspicion before a single answer was given. And Marcus paused, slowly straightening up, wiping his hands on a worn cloth, his expression steady, measured, as if he had encountered moments like this before, moments where explanations didn't always matter, where perception spoke louder than truth. "Just fixing my car," he said calmly, nodding toward the engine, his voice even, respectful. But something in that calm seemed to irritate Ryan more than it reassured him, because instead of stepping back, instead of observing, Ryan stepped forward, closer, his gaze scanning Marcus, then the car, then back again, as if searching for something that justified the tension already building. In his chest, "Step away from the vehicle," Ryan ordered, sharper now, his hand resting near his belt, not aggressive, but firm enough to signal control. And for a brief moment, everything seemed to slow. The distant sound of a dog barking, a screen door closing somewhere down the street, the faint buzz of cicadas in the trees, all fading behind the weight of that command. And Marcus didn't argue, didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped back, lifting his hands slightly, not in surrender but in acknowledgement, his eyes meeting Ryan's with a quiet steadiness that felt almost out of place in a moment like this. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, and for a split second, there was silence, the kind that stretches just long enough to feel uncomfortable, before Ryan exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if dismissing the question entirely. "We've had reports of a stolen vehicle matching this description," he said, though his tone suggested the conclusion had already been made. And without waiting for further explanation, he moved in, closing the distance, reaching for Marcus's wrist with a decisive motion, the metallic click of handcuffs slicing through the stillness of the street. And, just like that, the situation escalated, not through chaos, but through certainty, the kind that leaves no room for doubt, at least not on one side. A couple across the street slowed their walk, glancing over, a phone subtly raised, capturing the moment, because scenes like this, quiet but heavy, had a way of drawing attention without noise. And Marcus stood there, now restrained, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, as if the weight of the cuffs meant less to him than the assumptions behind them. "Officer," he said quietly, not pleading, not defensive, just deliberate. "You might want to check that again." But Ryan didn't respond, not really, because in his mind, the situation was already under control, already solved. Another incident filed away before it had even fully unfolded. And yet, there was something in Marcus's tone, something in the way he said it, not urgent, not emotional, just certain, that lingered in the air longer than it should have, like a warning that hadn't yet been understood. And as the seconds ticked by, unnoticed by most, something unseen was already set in motion, something that would arrive not with chaos, but with clarity. And when it did, it wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be dramatic, but it would be undeniable. The sound of the handcuffs settling into place lingered longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because of what it represented, a decision already made without all the facts. And Marcus stood there on the side of the road, the fading sunlight casting a long shadow behind him, while Officer Ryan Cole stepped back slightly, adjusting his stance as if everything was exactly where it needed to be. as if the situation had already been resolved in his favor, and yet the street did not move on the way it usually did, because now there were eyes watching, quiet, cautious, curious. A man watering his lawn slowed his movements. A woman across the street lowered her sunglasses just enough to see more clearly, and somewhere in the background a phone camera remained steady, capturing every second without a word. Marcus exhaled slowly, not out of frustration but out of control. The kind of control that came from experience, the kind that did not break under pressure. His gaze drifting briefly toward his car, then back to Ryan, who was now speaking into his radio, his tone clipped, official, reporting what he believed to be a routine arrest, his words confident, unshaken, and for a moment it seemed like nothing would interrupt that rhythm, like the outcome was already locked in place. But then Marcus spoke again, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough weight to cut through the static of the moment. "Officer, I am telling you, you should verify the registration." And there was no anger in it, no urgency, just certainty, the kind that did not beg to be heard but expected to be understood. And Ryan paused for half a second, just long enough to register the words, but not long enough to consider them, because he shook his head slightly, dismissing the suggestion as if it were nothing more than an excuse he had heard too many times before. "You can explain everything at the station," he replied, his tone firm, already turning away as if the conversation was over. And that was the moment something shifted, not outwardly, not in a way that anyone could point to immediately, but internally, in the space between assumption and reality. Because Marcus did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He simply nodded once, almost to himself, as if acknowledging a step in a process that was already unfolding beyond what anyone else could see. The air grew quieter, heavier, the kind of silence that does not come from the absence of sound, but from the presence of tension, and somewhere in the distance, faint at first, there was the low hum of an engine approaching, not fast, not urgent, just steady, deliberate. And Ryan did not notice it right away because his focus remained fixed on procedure, on control, on the belief that he was handling the situation exactly as he should. But Marcus noticed, his eyes shifting ever so slightly down the street, not reacting, not signaling, just observing. And if someone had been watching closely enough, they might have seen it, that subtle change, that quiet awareness that something was about to interrupt the narrative that had been so confidently written just moments before. "You said this vehicle was reported stolen," Marcus said after a brief pause, his voice still even, still composed. "Did you run the plate yourself?" And the question hung there, simple, direct, and for the first time, Ryan hesitated, not visibly, not enough for anyone to call it doubt, but enough that the rhythm of his actions slowed just a fraction, because the truth was, he had not personally, he had relied on a description, a call, a match that felt close enough. And in that split second, the certainty that had carried him began to thin, just slightly, like a crack forming beneath the surface of something that once felt solid. The approaching engine grew louder now, the low rumble of tires against asphalt drawing closer with each passing second, and the people watching began to notice, their attention shifting from the man in cuffs to the vehicle turning onto the street. A black sport utility vehicle, clean, unmarked, moving with a purpose that did not need to announce itself. And Ryan finally looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he tracked its movement. Something unfamiliar, something unexpected entering a scene he believed he controlled. And Marcus simply stood there, still, composed, the cuffs still in place, his posture unchanged. But his presence now carried something different, something that was no longer passive, no longer reactive, but quietly certain, as if the next few moments had already been written long before anyone else realized they were part of the story. The black sport utility vehicle rolled to a smooth and deliberate stop about 20 feet from where Marcus stood, its engine idling with a quiet authority that did not need flashing lights or sirens to announce its presence. And for a moment no one moved. Not the neighbors watching from across the street, not the man holding his phone, not even Officer Ryan Cole, whose posture remained rigid but whose eyes now tracked the vehicle with a growing uncertainty that he could not quite explain. Because something about it felt different, not urgent, not chaotic, just precise, controlled, and intentional. The driver's door opened first, followed by the rear passenger door, and two individuals stepped out, both dressed in clean, understated attire, dark suits that blended into the setting without drawing attention, yet somehow commanding it at the same time, their movements calm, unhurried, and completely out of sync with the tension that had built on the street just moments earlier. And as they approached, the air seemed to shift again, not louder, not heavier, but sharper, as if everything that had been assumed was now being quietly questioned. Marcus did not turn immediately. He did not call out or react. He simply stood there, hands still secured, his gaze forward, as if he had expected this moment down to the exact second. And when one of the individuals finally spoke, his voice was steady, professional, carrying just enough volume to reach both Marcus and Ryan without breaking the calm of the scene. "Sir, we need you to step back from him." And the words were not shouted, not aggressive, but they carried a weight that did not invite negotiation. Ryan blinked once, caught off guard not by the command itself, but by the certainty behind it, the kind that did not come from assumption but from authority, and instinctively he straightened, his hand shifting slightly as he turned to face them fully. "This is an active situation," he replied, his voice firm but now edged with something new, something less certain. "I have probable cause." And the man in the suit nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, his eyes briefly scanning Marcus before returning to Ryan. "And we have jurisdiction," he said, just as calmly. And for a second the two statements hung in the air, equal in tone but not in weight, because one was based on belief and the other on fact. The second individual stepped closer now, his gaze focused directly on Marcus, and without hesitation he reached into his jacket, pulling out a small leather case, flipping it open with a practiced motion that revealed a badge and identification, held just long enough for Ryan to see clearly, for the reality to settle in before the case was closed again. And in that moment, something inside Ryan shifted, not dramatically, not outwardly, but enough that the confidence he had carried began to fracture, because this was no longer a routine stop, no longer a simple misunderstanding. This was something else entirely. "Agent Reed," the man said, his tone respectful, almost routine, as if addressing Marcus in handcuffs on the side of a suburban street was the most normal thing in the world. And that was the moment everything changed, not with noise, not with force, but with clarity, because the name alone carried a weight that did not need explanation. And Ryan's gaze snapped back to Marcus, searching now, not for guilt, not for confirmation, but for understanding, for something that explained how the man he had just detained could be the same man being addressed with that level of recognition. Marcus finally turned his head slightly, meeting the eyes of the agent for a brief second before giving a small nod, the kind that acknowledged more than just presence, the kind that confirmed a process already in motion. And then his attention shifted back to Ryan, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that now felt entirely different. No longer passive, no longer patient, but resolute, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. The street remained silent, the neighbors still watching, the phone still recording, but now the story had shifted, the narrative that had seemed so clear just minutes ago unraveling in real time. And Ryan stood there, caught between what he thought he knew and what was now being revealed, the weight of his earlier decisions settling in with a quiet but undeniable force. Because in that moment he realized something he had not considered before, something that did not come with warning or preparation, only with consequence. And that was the simple truth that the man standing in front of him, the man he had already judged, was never just a man fixing his car. For a moment, no one spoke, not the neighbors, not the agents, not even the wind that had been gently moving through the trees, because the weight of what had just been said settled over the street with a quiet finality that could not be ignored. And Officer Ryan Cole stood there, his posture no longer as firm as it had been minutes ago, his mind racing to reconcile the situation he thought he controlled with the reality now unfolding in front of him, because the name he had just heard did not fit the narrative he had built. It did not match the assumptions he had made, and yet it was standing right there in front of him, calm, composed, and undeniable. "Agent Reed," Ryan repeated under his breath, not as a question but as an attempt to process, his eyes shifting between Marcus and the two men who had arrived, searching for something that would restore the balance he felt slipping away. But there was nothing in their expressions that suggested doubt or hesitation, only certainty. The kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are dealing with and why you are there. One of the agents stepped slightly closer, his tone still measured, still controlled. "We are going to need you to remove the restraints," he said, not as a request, but as a step in a process that had already begun, and Ryan hesitated. Not out of defiance, but out of the sudden awareness that every move he made now carried consequences far beyond what he had anticipated, his hand hovering for a brief second. Before he reached toward the cuffs, the metallic click this time sounding different, not sharp and decisive, but heavy, almost reluctant, as if even the sound itself understood the shift that had taken place. Marcus lowered his hands slowly once the cuffs were removed, rubbing his wrists briefly, not in discomfort, but in transition, his posture straightening as he adjusted his sleeves. The same calm expression on his face, but now carrying a presence that could no longer be mistaken for anything less than authority. And, as he turned to face Ryan fully, there was no anger in his eyes, no need for confrontation, only a steady clarity that made the moment feel even more intense than if he had raised his voice. "Officer Cole," Marcus said, his voice even, deliberate, and for the first time, Ryan realized that the man in front of him had known his name, had been aware of everything from the very beginning, and that realization settled in like a weight he could not shake. The second agent stepped forward now, his attention shifting to Ryan as he spoke. "This vehicle was not reported stolen," he stated plainly, each word precise, leaving no room for interpretation. "The registration is valid, and the owner is standing right here." And he gestured briefly toward Marcus, a simple motion that carried more impact than any accusation could have, because it stripped away every assumption and replaced it with fact. Ryan swallowed, his jaw tightening slightly as he glanced toward the car, then back at Marcus. The pieces of the situation rearranging themselves in his mind, forming a picture he had not expected to see, one where his certainty had been misplaced, where his actions were now being viewed from a completely different perspective, and the street, once just another quiet neighborhood, now felt like a stage where every detail mattered. "I was responding to a call," Ryan said, his voice no longer as steady, his words measured carefully, as if trying to regain some sense of control, but the first agent shook his head slightly, not dismissively, but with a calm understanding that did not validate the explanation. "And now you are part of the report," he replied, his tone unchanged, but the meaning clear, because this was no longer about a call, no longer about a vehicle. It was about what had happened in those few minutes and the decisions that had been made within them. Marcus took a small step forward, not closing the distance in a confrontational way, but enough to stand on equal ground, his gaze steady on Ryan, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a quiet weight that settled into the space between them. "You made a decision before you had the facts," he said, not accusing, not emotional, just stating what was now undeniable, and for Ryan, that was the moment it truly sank in, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, unavoidable realization that the authority he had relied on was never meant to replace judgment, and that the line between control and consequence had been crossed without him even noticing it. The silence that followed Marcus's words did not break. It deepened, settling into the space like something that refused to be ignored, and Officer Ryan Cole stood there with the weight of it pressing down on him, not from the agents, not from the small crowd watching from a distance, but from the realization forming in his own mind, slow but undeniable, that the situation was no longer about control. It was about accountability. The first agent shifted slightly, his attention now fully on Ryan, his voice calm but firm as he spoke again. "We are going to need your badge number and a statement regarding the events that just occurred." And there was no urgency in his tone, no aggression, just procedure, the kind that did not bend or adjust based on who stood in front of it. And for Ryan, that made it even harder to respond, because this was familiar territory in theory, but not in practice, not like this, not with the roles reversed. Ryan reached up instinctively, his fingers brushing against the badge pinned to his uniform, the symbol that had always represented authority, control, and certainty. But now it felt different, heavier, as if its meaning had shifted in real time, and for a brief moment he hesitated, not because he did not understand what was being asked, but because he did, and that understanding carried consequences he could not ignore. My badge number is 4172, he said finally, his voice lower than before, more measured, each word carefully placed as if trying to maintain some sense of order in a moment that no longer followed his expectations. And the second agent nodded, already noting it down, his movements efficient, practiced, as if this process was not unusual for him at all. Marcus remained where he was, his posture relaxed but his presence steady, watching the exchange without interruption, and there was something about the way he observed, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with clarity, that made the moment feel even more intense, because it was not about winning or losing. It was about truth being placed where assumption once stood. You said you had probable cause, the agent continued, his voice even. Can you specify what that was based on? And Ryan inhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the patrol car, then back again, searching for the right words, for something that would justify the decision he had made just minutes earlier. But now those words felt different, less certain, less solid than they had before. There was a report, he began, his tone cautious. A vehicle matching the description. And he paused, just for a second, because even as he said it, he could hear the gap in his own explanation, the space where verification should have been, where certainty should have replaced assumption. The agent listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and when Ryan finished, he gave a small nod, acknowledging the response without affirming it. And did you confirm the license plate before making contact? He asked, and the question landed with a quiet precision that cut deeper than any accusation could have, because it did not challenge Ryan's authority directly. It simply exposed the step that had been missed, the moment where process had been replaced by presumption. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes lowering for just a fraction of a second before returning to meet the agent's gaze. And in that moment, the answer was already clear, even before he spoke. No, he admitted, the words short, direct, and heavier than anything he had said so far, because it carried the weight of everything that had followed. The street remained still, the small audience watching without speaking, the phone still recording, capturing not just the event but the shift, the unraveling of a narrative that had once seemed so certain. And Marcus finally moved, just a single step forward, his hands now free, his stance balanced, his presence grounded in something that no longer needed to be explained. This is why procedure matters, Marcus said quietly, his voice calm but firm, not directed as an attack, but as a statement that carried more weight than volume ever could. And Ryan listened, not because he had to, but because in that moment, there was nothing else to do, no argument to make, no authority to assert, only the truth of what had happened and the consequences that now followed it, unfolding not with chaos, but with a clarity that left no room for denial. The weight of Marcus's words did not fade. It settled deeper, threading itself into the silence that now defined the street. And Officer Ryan Cole could feel it, not as pressure from the outside, but as something internal, something that shifted the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he processed the moment unfolding around him. Because this was no longer about a call, no longer about a vehicle. It was about a decision that had already been made and the realization that it had been made. Too quickly, the agent holding the notepad finished writing and glanced up, his eyes steady, professional. We are documenting this as a field incident pending internal review, he said, his tone neutral, but the words carried a finality that could not be softened. And Ryan gave a small nod, not because he agreed, but because there was nothing left to challenge, nothing left to correct in the moment, only the process moving forward. Marcus stepped back toward his vehicle, the same car that had been the center of the misunderstanding, now quiet, unchanged, as if it had simply waited for the truth to catch up with it. And he rested his hand lightly on the edge of the open hood, his fingers tracing the cool metal for a brief second, grounding himself in something real, something unaffected by assumption. And when he turned back, his expression remained composed, but there was a clarity in his gaze that had sharpened, something that spoke not just of the present moment, but of the pattern behind it. Do you know how often this happens? Marcus said, not raising his voice, not directing it at anyone in particular, but allowing the question to exist in the space between them. And no one answered, not because they could not, but because the answer was not simple. not something that could be reduced to a number or a single explanation, and Ryan felt that question more than he heard it, because it did not accuse him directly. It invited him to think beyond the moment, beyond the street, beyond the uniform he wore. The first agent shifted his stance slightly, his attention moving between Marcus and Ryan, understanding that this was no longer just about documentation. It was about acknowledgement, and while his role remained procedural, there was a subtle awareness in his posture that something more significant had just taken place, something that would not be resolved by paperwork alone. Ryan glanced briefly at the small group of onlookers, noticing now what he had ignored before, the quiet observation, the phone still recording, the unspoken judgment that came not from hostility, but from witnessing, and for the first time, he saw the situation from outside himself, not as the one in control, but as part of the moment being watched, evaluated. Remembered, I followed the information I was given, Ryan said after a pause, his voice steady but lower, less certain, as if he were choosing his words more carefully than before, and Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the statement without dismissing it. Information is only part of the job, he replied, his tone calm. Verification is the rest. And the simplicity of the response carried more weight than any extended explanation could have, because it did not argue. It clarified. The second agent closed his notepad and stepped back slightly, signaling that the immediate process was complete, but the atmosphere did not return to normal. It remained charged, not with tension, but with understanding, the kind that lingers after something important has been revealed. Marcus walked a few steps away from the group, then turned back one last time, his gaze settling on Ryan, not with judgment, not with anger, but with a quiet steadiness that made the moment feel final. This was not about the car, he said, his voice even. And you know that. And Ryan did not respond, not because he disagreed, but because there was nothing left to say, no justification that could change what had already happened, only the awareness of it, settling in slowly, completely. The sun dipped lower, the shadows stretching longer across the pavement, and the street began to breathe again, the distant sounds returning, the normal rhythm creeping back in. But something had shifted, something that would not simply fade with time, because moments like this do not disappear. They stay, not as noise, but as clarity, as a reminder that authority without understanding is not control, it is risk, and that sometimes the most important lessons do not come from being right, but from realizing when you were wrong. The street slowly returned to motion, but not to normal, because something had been seen, something had been understood, and even as the neighbors began to lower their phones and step back into their routines, there was a quiet awareness that lingered, like the echo of a moment that would not easily fade. And Officer Ryan Cole remained standing near his patrol car, his hands now resting at his sides, his posture no longer rigid but uncertain, as if the structure he relied on had shifted beneath him. Marcus Reed turned back to his car, his movements calm and deliberate, reaching under the hood once more as if the interruption had only been a pause, not a disruption, and for a few seconds, the only sound was the soft clink of metal and the distant hum of traffic returning to its rhythm. But even that normalcy felt different now, because the silence between actions carried meaning. The agents stood nearby, no longer intervening, their presence now observational, allowing the moment to settle on its own, because what had needed to happen had already happened, and there was no urgency left, only consequence. Ryan watched Marcus for a moment, his gaze no longer filled with suspicion, but with something more complex, something quieter, and for the first time since he stepped out of his patrol car, he took a step forward without authority behind it, without command in his voice, just a simple movement that carried intention. "Agent Reed," he said, the words slower now, more deliberate, as if he understood the weight they carried, and Marcus paused, glancing up from the engine, not startled, not defensive, just aware. "I should have checked," Ryan continued, his voice steady but stripped of the certainty it once held. "I should have taken the time to verify before acting." And the admission did not come easily. It was not polished or rehearsed, but it was real, and that made it matter, because it did not attempt to undo what had happened. It simply acknowledged it. Marcus straightened up slowly, wiping his hands again, his expression unchanged but his attention now fully on Ryan. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, because sometimes the space between words carries more truth than the words themselves. You made a choice, Marcus said finally, his tone calm, not harsh, not forgiving, just clear, and now you see what that choice leads to. And there was no anger in his voice, only a quiet certainty that made it impossible to dismiss, because it was not about him personally. It was about something larger, something that extended beyond that street, beyond that moment. Ryan nodded once, his jaw tightening slightly, not in resistance but in acceptance, because the clarity of the situation left no room for anything else. And as he glanced briefly toward the agents, then back at Marcus, he seemed to understand that the outcome of this moment would not be decided here, not on the pavement, not in front of onlookers, but somewhere else, through a process that would examine every detail he had overlooked. The first agent checked his watch briefly, then looked up. "We will follow up with your department," he said to Ryan, his tone unchanged, procedural, and Ryan gave another nod, quieter this time, because there was nothing left to argue, only to accept. Marcus stepped back from the car, closing the hood with a soft, controlled motion, the sound echoing slightly in the quiet air, and as he did, the setting sun cast a warm light across the street, softening the edges of everything but not erasing what had happened. He looked at Ryan one last time, his gaze steady, not confrontational, not dismissive, but firm in a way that did not need emphasis. "Next time," Marcus said, his voice low but clear, "make sure there is a next step before you act." And the words settled in, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a lesson, one that did not need repetition. Ryan stood there as Marcus turned away, as the agents began to step back toward their vehicle, as the street resumed its quiet rhythm. And in that moment, he understood something he had not fully grasped before, that authority is not proven in how quickly you act, but in how carefully you choose when to act. And that sometimes, the difference between control and consequence is measured in the seconds you decide to take or ignore. The agent's vehicle pulled away without urgency, its presence fading as quietly as it had arrived, leaving behind a street that looked unchanged on the surface but carried something different beneath it, something that could not be seen but could be felt in the way the air settled, in the way people moved just a little more thoughtfully than before. And Officer Ryan Cole remained where he was, standing beside his patrol car, as if unsure whether to follow the routine he had known for years or to pause and absorb what had just happened, because for the first time in a long time, routine did not feel like enough. Marcus Reed turned the ignition of his car, the engine responding with a steady hum now that the issue had been resolved, a small but meaningful contrast to the tension that had filled the same space just minutes earlier. And he sat there for a moment with his hands resting on the steering wheel, not rushing to leave, not lingering unnecessarily, simply allowing the moment to settle into something final. Across the street, the neighbors had begun to disperse, conversations quiet and reflective, phones lowered, the event already transitioning from something witnessed in real time to something that would be remembered and discussed later, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because of what it revealed. Ryan finally moved, stepping toward his patrol car, opening the door but not getting in right away, his hand resting on the frame as he looked back toward Marcus's vehicle. And there was a hesitation there, not born from uncertainty about what to do next, but from an awareness that whatever came next would not be the same as before. Marcus glanced in the rearview mirror briefly, his eyes meeting Ryan's reflection for just a second, and there was no hostility in that glance. No need to revisit what had already been said, only a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had reached its end, and then he shifted the car into drive, pulling forward slowly, merging back into the flow of the street as if reclaiming something that had been interrupted but not taken. Ryan watched as the car moved away, the distance between them growing with each second, and with that distance came a clarity that had been forming since the moment the black sport utility vehicle arrived, a realization that did not come with noise or force, but with stillness, the kind that leaves no room for distraction. He closed the door of his patrol car, but did not start the engine, instead sitting down slowly, his hands resting on the steering wheel in a way that mirrored Marcus's earlier posture, and for a brief moment, everything aligned in a way that was impossible to ignore, the same position, the same silence, but entirely different understanding. The radio crackled faintly in the background, a reminder that the world outside this street was still moving, still calling for action, still expecting decisions to be made. But Ryan did not reach for it immediately, because now he understood something he had not fully grasped before, that every call, every report, every description carried more than just information. It carried responsibility, and that responsibility could not be fulfilled by speed alone. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering to the dashboard before lifting again, this time not scanning for threats or irregularities, but simply observing, taking in the details he had overlooked earlier, the calm of the neighborhood, the absence of urgency, the normalcy that had been present all along. In the distance, Marcus's car turned a corner and disappeared from view, leaving behind not just an empty stretch of road, but a moment that would remain long after the scene itself had ended. And Ryan knew, without needing anyone to tell him, that what happened here would follow him, not as punishment alone, but as a measure, a point of reference that would shape every decision he made from this point forward. Because some moments do not need to be repeated to be understood, they only need to be seen clearly once. And in that clarity, they leave behind something stronger than consequence, something that stays, something that changes the way you see the badge you wear, the authority you carry, and the choices you make when no one is there to correct you. Because the truth is the most important. Judgment does not come from others. It comes from the moment you realize what you should have done differently. And that realization does not fade. It remains steady and unspoken, guiding every step that follows. The street had returned to its quiet rhythm, but for Officer Ryan Cole, the silence inside his patrol car was louder than anything he had experienced that day, because now there was no distraction, no movement, no urgency to hide behind, only the steady presence of his own thoughts, replaying the moment again and again, not in flashes of action, but in the small decisions that led to it, the seconds he did not take, the questions he did not ask, the certainty he assumed instead of confirming. The radio crackled once more, a voice calling out another routine dispatch somewhere across town. But Ryan did not respond immediately, his hand hovering near the receiver before lowering again, because something had shifted in him, something that made rushing into the next call feel different, heavier, as if every future decision now carried the echo of this one. Miles away, Marcus Reed drove steadily through the late afternoon traffic, the golden light fading into the softer tones of early evening. His hands relaxed on the wheel, his expression calm, but his mind not untouched by what had happened, because moments like that do not simply pass. They settle, they linger, not as anger, but as reminders of how quickly perception can shape reality, and how easily dignity can be challenged without a second thought. He turned onto a quieter road, the hum of the engine steady, the world outside moving as it always did, but inside, there was a clarity that had been reinforced, not newly discovered, but confirmed, that truth does not always arrive in time to prevent the moment, but it always arrives in time to define it. Back on the suburban street, Ryan finally reached for the radio, his voice quieter than before, more measured as he acknowledged the call, not with the automatic tone of routine, but with intention, each word chosen, each response grounded in a way that had not been there earlier. And as he pulled away from the curb, the patrol car merging back into the flow of the city, there was no sense of closure, no clean ending, only continuation, but it was a different kind of continuation, one shaped by awareness rather than assumption. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the roads that connected both men, two paths moving forward from the same moment, one carrying the weight of having been judged too quickly, the other carrying the responsibility of having judged without full understanding. And somewhere between those paths was the truth that neither of them could ignore. Ryan drove in silence for a while, passing familiar streets that now felt slightly unfamiliar, not because they had changed, but because he had, even if only in a small way, even if only in the questions he now asked himself before acting. And as he approached a stoplight, the red glow reflecting off his windshield, he paused, not just because the light demanded it, but because it mirrored something deeper, a reminder that stopping, even for a moment, can change everything that follows. Marcus, miles ahead, slowed at his own intersection, the light turning green just as he approached, And he continued forward without hesitation, his path clear, his direction steady, not because the world had made it easy, but because he had learned how to move through it without losing himself, without letting moments like the one he experienced define him, but instead refine his understanding of it. The city carried on, as it always does, with its noise and motion and endless intersections of lives that cross and separate without warning. But for those who had been part of that quiet street earlier, something remained, something that would not fade with distance or time, because it was not just about what happened, it was about what it revealed, and in the end, the truth stood simple and unshaken, not